The regulation board at Kethvoreth covered the entire east wall of the assessor's waiting corridor, 6 panels wide, floor to near ceiling, updated weekly with the current batch of compact border protocol amendments, transit instrument filing deadlines, and sovereignty classification guidelines. In 3 postings over 14 years, I had never seen anyone read it. Not all the way through. Not slowly. Transit residents moving through the corridor would glance at it, the way people glance at a wall they have decided is not for them, and move on. Even the administrative staff who worked the desks adjacent to it rarely looked at it for more than a few seconds at a time, long enough to locate a specific deadline and confirm it before returning to whatever task was open on their terminal. On my 3rd morning at the node, I came in early to review the prior day's infrastructure survey notes. The Level 2 recirculation manifold had a pressure variance I wanted to log before the morning case queue opened, and I found a small Velthoran girl sitting on the bench directly across from the regulation board, reading it. Not skimming, reading. Her eyes moved left to right across each line the way a person reads when they are trying to understand every word, not locate a specific one. She was working through the sovereignty classification section, which ran 4 dense paragraphs in the compact standard 12-point administrative font. Her lips moved slightly on the longer compound phrases. When she reached the end of a paragraph, she sat still for a moment before moving to the next. It was the deliberate stillness of someone letting a thing settle before going further. The patience of a reader who has decided that moving on before you understand is a way of wasting the time you already spent. She was small, even for a Velthoran child. Lavender-gray skin, the pale shade common in the Highland lineages of the second house. Silver-white hair, cut short in the practical way that children in long-term transit situations often have it, neat, maintenance-free, a haircut that requires no equipment that transit life does not guarantee. Large eyes, pale amber, the kind of color that looks lit from the inside in morning light. She wore a standard-issue Transit's Day coverall in the compact's gray-blue, slightly too large at the shoulders, the sleeves turned back twice. A Transit Day lanyard hung around her neck with a case number I did not read. I set my notes down at the assessor's table. She did not look over. I logged the manifold variants. She finished the sovereignty classification section and moved, without pausing, to the transit instrument filing procedures that followed it. I said, that section is mostly about deadlines. She looked over, not startled. The look was evaluative, the kind of attention that is gathering information rather than reacting to stimulus. I had the impression she had been aware I was in the room since I sat down and had simply not found it necessary to look until I spoke. I know, she said. The deadline for a sovereignty code amendment is 14 days from the classification trigger date. The deadline for a sponsorship restoration request is 72 hours from the rejection notice. She looked back at the board. I am trying to understand the difference between a classification trigger date and a rejection notice date. I looked at the board, then back at her. Those are 2 different clocks, I said. The classification trigger is when the audit runs. The rejection notice is when you get the result. The time between them can be days. She was quiet for a moment. So if the audit ran on the 9th, she said, and the notice came on the 11th, the 72-hour window started on the 11th. That's right. She nodded once. Then she went back to reading. I went back to my notes. That was the 1st morning. She was there the 2nd morning too, and the 3rd. The 4th morning I came in, and she was already on the bench before the corridor lights had fully brightened. She must have arrived before the 1st hour, and she was on the same panel she had been reading the previous day, which meant she either had not made much progress or had gone back to something she wanted to be sure of before moving forward. The 5th morning I realized she was doing both. She moved forward methodically, but each session started with a return to the last few paragraphs of the previous session's work, reading them again before going on. the way a person rereads the bottom of the previous page before beginning the new one. She was building something, not just reading for information but constructing a map, a complete picture of the regulatory framework that governed the situation she was in, assembled from the board one section at a time. By the fourth morning, I had stopped being surprised to find her on the bench when I came in early, and by the sixth, I had started bringing 2 cups of tea from the corridor dispenser, rather than one, setting the second at the near end of the bench without comment, in a position that could be reached without requiring her to interrupt what she was reading. She accepted this without acknowledging it for the first 2 mornings, which told me the gesture had registered, but that she had decided it did not require formal response. On the 8th morning she said, without looking up from the board, "The dispenser on this level has 2 settings. You use the second one." I told her the second setting had a different temperature that worked better for the kind of tea in the morning. She looked over at that with the evaluative expression, and then looked at her cup and tried it more carefully, and went back to reading. I thought that was a reasonable way to accept a thing. Her name was Sale. I learned this on the 5th morning when she introduced herself with the precision of someone who understands that names are data and should be provided accurately. "Sale," she said. "Velthorin, second house, Highland registration. My case number is K9471. She said the case number the way an adult official would, not the way a child recites something they have been told to recite, with the specific emphasis of someone who has learned that the number is the useful thing, the thing that moves actions in administrative systems. I told her my name, and that I was an infrastructure assessor on a 6-week rotation. "What does an infrastructure assessor do?" she asked. "Evaluates the physical systems that keep a facility running," I said. "Recirculation, pressurization, structural load tolerances, the parts of the building that don't have case numbers." She considered this. "The manifold on level 2 has been irregular for 11 days, she said. "I can hear it from the east corridor at the 3rd hour." I looked up from my notes. "The pressure variance," she said. "It produces a frequency change, a small one. Most people don't notice it." "I noticed it," I said. "That's why I'm here early today." She seemed to file this as satisfactory. "Have you fixed it?" "I logged it," I said. "The repair request is in the queue." She went back to reading. After a moment she said, "The queue for maintenance requests at a border node runs between 4 and 9 days, depending on classification priority." "That's about right," I said. "You should reclassify it as a level 2 safety adjacency," she said. "That reduces the response window to 48 hours. I looked at the board. There was, in the 3rd panel from the left, a maintenance priority classification table I had not closely read. I pulled it toward me and read it. She was correct. The pressure variance in a recirculation manifold on a level shared with medical assessment rooms qualified for a safety adjacency reclassification under the 4th criterion. The criterion read, "Environmental irregularities affecting administrative assessment conditions in shared level facilities." Medical assessment rooms were administrative assessment facilities. The level 2 manifold variance qualified precisely. I filed the amended repair request. The repair team arrived the following morning. I did not tell her this immediately. When I came in the next day and she was on her bench and I set the second cup at the near end, I said, after a moment, "The manifold team came this morning." "I know," she said. "The frequency changed at the 5th hour." This was the 7th morning. By the 8th morning I had stopped thinking of the early hours as my time to work alone, and had started thinking of them as the time Sale and I were both in the assessor's corridor. The quality of silence was different when another person is also reading something with genuine attention. More organized somehow, more like a shared condition than an absence. The corridor outside the assessor's room would fill later in the morning, with the ordinary transit node density of people moving between administrative offices and common areas. carrying their cases and their documents, and the particular weighted posture of people who are waiting for decisions to resolve. But in the early hours before the case queue opened, it was Sale on the bench and me at the table, both reading, the second cup of tea at the near end of the bench. On the 7th morning, she asked me how long my rotation lasted. 6 weeks, I said. I'm in the 3rd week. She considered this. Then you have 3 weeks remaining. Yes. She went back to reading. After a moment she said, the border node's structural assessment cycle runs every 18 months. The South Wing has not had a documented assessment since the node's 3rd year of operation. She looked over. There is a notation in the facility's administrative record. Level 1 common area, 2nd corridor, a load tolerance flag that was noted and not followed up. I looked at her. I read the facility's administrative record last week, she said. It is posted in the registration office, panel 4. I had not read panel 4 of the registration office. I added it to the morning's task list and went down before the case queue opened. She was right about the load tolerance flag. It was a 17-month-old notation in the administrative shorthand that border nodes use when they want to have documented something without committing to an action. The South Wing Corridor, 3rd section. I had been planning to get to it in week 4. I moved it to week 3. On the 8th morning I asked her, while she was reading and I was reviewing the South Wing's previous day measurements, whether she had eaten breakfast. She looked over at me with the evaluative expression. Yes, she said. At the 6th hour before I came. She paused. The level 1 common area opens at the 5th hour. The tea dispenser in this corridor is available at the 4th. She looked at the cup at the end of the bench. You have been here before the 4th hour on 3 mornings. Sometimes the assessment notes take longer, I said. She accepted this as an answer and went back to reading. After a moment she said, the common area at the 6th hour has a grain preparation that I have not been able to identify from the available documentation. The facility menu lists it as a standard breakfast grain. The standard breakfast grain on the level 3 schedule description references 6 varieties. There are only 4 in rotation. The other 2 are probably seasonal, I said. The supply schedule for border nodes shifts with the transit routes. Some items come through regularly and some come through when the route allows. She was quiet. Then, I would like to know what the other 2 are. I'll ask the facility's coordinator, I said. I did that afternoon. The 2 missing varieties were a Highland Velthorin grain that came through on the northern supply run, currently delayed, and a compact standard grain that the node's kitchen had substituted out because the level 2 cold storage unit ran warm on one shelf. I came back the next morning with the answer. She wrote it in the small notebook she kept in the coverall's front pocket. I had seen her writing in it before but had not asked what she put there. I have been documenting the discrepancies in the facility's posted documentation, she said when she saw me notice the notebook. The menu board, the maintenance schedule, the transit route listing, the posted documentation at a border node is rarely current. The gap between what is posted and what is true is where most of the errors come from. I thought about the sovereignty code table, the gap between the posted code and the current entry, 1 day. Yes, I said, that's usually where they come from. She read the regulation board with the systematic approach of someone building a complete map. She did not skip sections. She did not read the parts that seemed relevant and leave the rest. She read straight through, panel by panel, returning each morning to where she had stopped the previous day with a brief backward review before moving forward. By the 9th morning she had reached the final panel, which contained the border node governance structure and the chain of authority for filing exceptions and appeals. By this point, our mornings had developed their own texture. She asked questions when she encountered something the board did not fully explain. The relationship between 2 citation codes, the meaning of a procedural term that appeared in one context but not another, the practical difference between two categories of filing that the board defined as distinct without explaining why the distinction mattered. I answered in the way I answered questions about infrastructure, directly, with the minimum amount of framing that allowed the answer to be complete. She did not want context she had not asked for. She wanted the answer to the question she had asked, and she would derive the context from it herself. On the 8th morning, she asked me why the sovereignty code table was updated on a rolling basis, rather than on a fixed schedule. Because sovereignty designations change when houses merge, dissolve, or establish new branches, I said. A fixed schedule would create gaps. The rolling update keeps the table current. But it also creates lag between a filing date and the current table entry, she said. Yes. So a filing that uses the previous day's table entry can be flagged as a mismatch, even if the discrepancy is only one day. Yes, I said, it's a known issue. The amendment procedure in the third panel accounts for it. She looked at the third panel. She had read it 4 mornings ago. The table lag amendment, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to the final panel. On the 9th morning, she read that panel for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she said, the chain of authority for an exception to a batch transfer order has 6 steps. Yes, I said. The first 4 require standing above grade 3, she said. The 5th can be filed by an assessor with a current compact credential and a documented case adjacency. She looked at me. Does an infrastructure assessor have a current compact credential? Yes, I said. She looked back at the board. What is a case adjacency? A documented connection between the assessor's active case file and the case in question, I said. If the physical systems I'm assessing affect the conditions of the case. She was quiet for a moment. The level 2 recirculation manifold, she said, is on the same level as the medical assessment rooms where my mother's sponsorship review was conducted. I looked up from my notes. The pressure variance was active during the review period, she said. The frequency irregularity is documented in your maintenance log. I put my notes down. She did not look at me. She was still looking at the board. Her expression had not changed. It was the same evaluative attention she brought to everything she read. But her hands, which had been resting flat on her knees, were now clasped together, the knuckles pale against the gray-blue of the coverall. Sale, I said. She looked over. Tell me what happened to your mother's sponsorship registration. She told me precisely. The sovereignty classification audit had run on the 9th of the month. Her mother's sponsorship registration had been submitted on the 7th, ahead of the audit. The audit had flagged a cross-reference mismatch between the registration's sovereignty code field and the current sovereignty table entry for the second house. The mismatch had generated a rejection notice on the 11th. The rejection notice had started the 72-hour clock. Today was the 13th. The clock had 41 hours left. She said all of this in the order she had assembled it, from the board and from whatever her mother had told her, and from 11 days of sitting in the assessor's corridor reading every regulation that governed her situation. She said it without a break in her voice. Her hands stayed clasped. She looked at me steadily while she spoke, with the same attention she gave to the board, not for a response, but to ensure the information was being received accurately. When she finished, I said, "What was the sovereignty code mismatch?" "The second house sovereignty table entry was updated on the 6th, she said. My mother's registration used the sovereignty code from the table that was current on the 5th. 1 day's difference. The old code and the new code differ in 3 characters. I pulled my case tablet toward me and opened the active file index. I found K9471 and its linked documentation. I found the sovereignty classification audit report, the rejection notice, and the sponsorship registration, all filed in sequence, each one timestamped. She was right about the code. The registration had been filed on the 7th using the 5th table entry. The audit had cross-referenced against the 6th update. 3 characters off. The system had flagged it as a mismatch and issued an automated rejection without reviewing whether the discrepancy was a substantive sovereignty dispute or a one-day table lag. It was a one-day table lag. I had seen this before at 2 other postings in 2 other contexts. The sovereignty classification table was updated on a rolling basis. Filing windows were tight. One-day lags between the current table and a filing that used the previous day's entry were a known administrative artifact, common enough that the 3rd panel of the Regulation Board had an explicit amendment procedure for correcting them. The amendment process was in the section that Sale had been reading on the first morning I found her here. She had found the amendment procedure before she knew she needed it. She had read the table lag section on the first morning because she read everything, and she had filed it in her complete map of the regulatory framework. And when her mother's rejection notice came, she had known exactly where it was. She had been sitting on that bench reading toward the governance panel, toward the exception chain, toward the 5th step that could be filed by an assessor with a current credential and a documented case adjacency. She had found my credential and my maintenance log and the environmental criterion before she told me what she needed. She had come to me with everything I would need to file already identified. I looked at the Sovereignty Code Amendment procedure. Under an assessor's credential with documented case adjacency, I could file a code correction and a sponsorship restoration request simultaneously. The correction would not require Grade 3 standing if the case adjacency was established in writing, and the error was a table lag mismatch rather than a disputed sovereignty claim. The pressure variance in the Level 2 manifold. Medical assessment rooms on Level 2. The sponsorship review conducted in those rooms during the period the variance was active. The maintenance log I had filed, time-stamped, documenting the irregularity. The safety adjacency reclassification, already in the record, citing the 4th environmental criterion. Environmental irregularities affecting administrative assessment conditions in shared-level facilities. I had used that criterion to reclassify the repair request. Sale had found the criterion. It was in my log. It was time-stamped, and it specifically described the relationship between the manifold variance and the administrative assessment rooms on Level 2. The case adjacency argument was thin, not wrong, but thin enough that a skeptical reviewer could push back on whether a recirculation variance in a shared-level corridor constituted a genuine adjacency to a sponsorship review outcome. But the environmental criterion was specific. The log was clean. The timeline was documented, and I had 41 hours. I pulled up the amendment form and began filling it out. Sale watched me for a moment without speaking. Then she looked back at the regulation board and went on reading the final panel. She did not ask what I was filing or whether I thought it would work. She had said what she needed to say. Now she was reading. I worked through the form carefully. The case adjacency documentation required a narrative explanation of fewer than 300 words. I wrote it in the precise language of an infrastructure report, citing the maintenance reclassification criterion by number, the applicable subclause, and the timestamps of the variance log and the assessment room assignments. The sovereignty code correction required the old code, the new code, and the source documentation for the update date. I found the table update log in the Compact's administrative archive, pulled the 6th of the month entry, and attached it to the form. The sponsorship restoration request required a statement of the substantive case for the registration's validity. I wrote it in 4 sentences, citing the filing date, the table lag duration, the automated rejection mechanism, and the amendment criterion number from the 3rd panel of the regulation board. I filed all 3 documents as a linked set at the 7th hour of the 13th day, 40 hours before the batch transfer window closed. Then I closed the tablet and finished my tea. Sale was reading the governance structure section. She had her head slightly tilted, the way she did when a sentence required more than one pass to resolve. I had learned this about her over 11 mornings. The slight tilt was not confusion but deliberate attention, the physical signal of a mind that does not rush past the parts it does not fully understand, and is not embarrassed by the time it takes to understand them correctly. After a moment she said, without looking up, "You filed." "Yes," I said. She went back to reading. I said, "I don't know if it will clear." She said, "I know." Then, after a pause, "The case adjacency argument is defensible. The environmental irregularity criterion is the right one. You use the correct form. The code source documentation is clean." She turned to look at me. "Whether it clears depends on who reviews it." "Yes," I said. She nodded once and went back to the board. I packed my notes and went up to the Level 3 assessment rooms to log the day's structural survey. The node's eastern wing had a load tolerance discrepancy in the third corridor that I had been documenting all week, the kind of issue that accumulates slowly in structures older than their design intended, stress patterns calcifying into the building's permanent record. The work was technical and absorbed my full attention, which was useful. Thinking about the filing was not useful. Either it would clear or it would not. The decision was not mine anymore. It belonged to whoever in the processing office pulled the linked document set and read it through. I had written the case adjacency argument as clearly as I could. I had cited the correct criterion. The environmental irregularity clause was specific enough. Environmental irregularities affecting administrative assessment conditions in shared-level facilities. The manifold variance was documented. The medical assessment rooms were on Level 2. The sponsorship review had been conducted in those rooms during the period of the variance. The maintenance log had the timestamps. The reclassification request had the environmental criterion cited by number. If the reviewer read what was there, the argument held. If the reviewer was the kind of person who read case adjacency claims looking for reasons to reject them rather than reasons to accept them, they could push back on the connection between a recirculation manifold and a sponsorship review outcome. The argument was defensible, not airtight. Airtight would have required a grade 3 standing I did not have. Some things you construct as well as you can with the materials available, and then you let them be what they are. I had also written the sponsorship restoration request in 4 sentences, which was the minimum the form required, because in my experience of administrative documents, a shorter argument that is completely supported is harder to push back against than a longer argument that invites examination of each component. The 4 sentences stated exactly what had happened, cited the applicable amendment criterion, and left nothing for a skeptical reader to push on. I had learned this from 14 years of infrastructure reports. A document that says only what it needs to say and says it precisely does not give a reviewer anywhere to put a doubt. Sale had understood this before I did. She had built her 11 mornings of reading into the minimum possible argument. Not a petition, not an appeal to sympathy, but a clear path from the Regulation Board's 3rd panel to the Regulation Board's 6th panel, with my credential and my maintenance log as the bridge. She had done her part, I had done mine, now it was someone else's desk. I ate in the Level 1 common area at the midday hour. At the far end of the common area, I saw a Velthoran woman seated alone at a corner table. She was tall for the Highland lineage, with the same lavender-gray skin as Sale, the same pale amber eyes. Her hair was silver-white longer, pulled back without ornamentation. She wore a transit stay classification in standard compact gray, no rank markings, no house designation visible. She was eating with the methodical attention of someone who eats when they can and does not think about the meal while they eat it, reading a small tablet held in her left hand. Her posture was contained, not rigid but precise, the posture of a person trained to occupy exactly the space they are occupying and no more. I did not look long enough to read her case number. That afternoon, I worked through the Level 3 load tolerance documentation and began the structural assessment of the south wing. The south wing was the oldest section of the node prefab construction from the early settlement period, maintenance-intensive, with the layered repair history that accumulates in any structure in continuous use longer than its original design intended. There is something clarifying about this kind of assessment work. The building tells you the truth about itself if you are willing to read the signs it leaves: stress fractures at the load points, pressure differentials in the circulation lines, the places where temporary repairs have calcified into permanent features and need to be read for what they are rather than what they were intended to be. Infrastructure does not perform. It simply exists and is what it is, and the job is to read it accurately. I was on the south wing's third corridor, logging a bearing surface measurement, when my case tablet signaled a filing response. I read it standing in the corridor with the assessment kit at my feet, and the bearing surface measurement still open on the secondary screen. The sovereignty code amendment had been accepted. The table lag determination had been upheld under the fourth environmental criterion. The sponsorship restoration request had been approved. The batch transfer flag on case K9471 had been rescinded. The transfer order was gone. Sales case was clear. I stood in the south corridor for a moment with the tablet in my hand. The corridor was empty in both directions. The bearing surface measurement was waiting on the secondary screen. I closed it, logged the assessment session, and packed the kit. I went back to the assessor's corridor on level 1. The bench across from the regulation board was empty. The morning hours were long past, and there was no reason for Sale to be there in the mid-afternoon. The corridor was quiet, a few transit residents moving between the administrative offices and the common areas, carrying the particular weighted patience of people whose lives are currently governed by processes they did not initiate and cannot accelerate. The regulation board's sixth panel caught the afternoon light from the corridor's west window, and the governance structure section was legible from where I stood. I read it from across the corridor, 6 steps in the exception chain. The 5th step, available to an assessor with a current credential and a documented case adjacency. She had found it, sitting on that bench every morning for 11 days, reading straight through from the first panel to the 6th. I sat at the assessor's table and finished the south wing's documentation. There was another hour and a half of work in the assessment logs, and I worked through it with the steady attention the job required. When the corridor's afternoon light shifted to evening, I saved the files, packed my kit, and went to the level 1 common area for the evening meal. I was finishing when a compact administrative aide from the node's registration desk came to my table. "Mr. Vaz," he said, "there's a message from the border node processing office. The sovereignty code amendment you filed this morning was flagged for senior review as a courtesy, standard procedure when an assessor's credential is used for a case exception. The senior processing officer wants you to know it cleared on the first pass." He paused. "She said it was cleanly filed." "Thank you," I said. He nodded and went back to his desk. I finished my meal and went to my quarters. The next morning I came in at the early hour, as I always did. I brought 2 cups from the corridor dispenser, the second at the second setting, and I set the second cup at the near end of the bench before I sat down. Sale was not on the bench. I had expected this. The case was clear, the transfer flag was gone, and whatever came next for Sale and her mother was no longer governed by the 72-hour clock I had stopped. She did not owe me a morning of reading. I opened my assessment notes and looked at the south wing documentation. The bearing surface measurement from the previous afternoon was the last item in the open log. I picked up where I had left off. An hour into the morning session, I heard the corridor fill. It was not loud. It was more a change in the density of presence, the sound of several people moving with deliberate coordination rather than the ordinary ambient movement of a transit node at the early hour. I looked up. 6 Velthoran figures had entered the assessor's corridor from the east entrance. They wore dark gray, not uniforms exactly, but the kind of neutral formal attire that performs the function of a uniform without being one. Coordinated, precise, with the particular controlled economy of movement that belongs to people trained to be continuously aware of their position in a room relative to everything else in it. They spread without visible instruction, 2 positioning at the east entrance, 2 at the corridor's midpoint, 2 near the assessor's table. They were not blocking anything. They were simply present, in the way that a structure's weight-bearing elements are present, not for show but load-bearing. Through the east entrance, behind the 6, came a woman. She was tall. The same lavender-gray skin I had seen at the far end of the common area yesterday, the same pale amber eyes, the same silver-white hair. But today, she was not in the transit-stay gray of a compact border node classification. Today she wore the formal attire of the Velthoran second house, deep blue, structured at the shoulders, with the silver thread house insignia along the collar line that I recognized from the 3rd panel of the regulation board, where the house designations are illustrated for border personnel who might need to identify them in the field. At her side, matching her pace exactly, was Sale. The woman's expression as she walked was composed and formal, the expression of someone who has spent years in situations that require composure and formality, and has learned to wear it at rest. She was looking at me. I registered this and did not move, because moving seemed like the wrong response to the approach of someone walking with that kind of settled directional intention. The 6 in gray watched her cross the corridor. 2 of them exchanged a glance. I noted this because it was the first non-coordinated movement any of them had made since entering, a glance that communicated that something they had not anticipated was occurring, and they were calibrating. The woman stopped 2 paces from the assessor's table. For a moment she simply looked at me. Then she did something I have thought about many times since, in the way you think about things that do not fit your prior categories, and that you keep returning to until you understand why. She bowed. Not the formal Velthoran nod of acknowledgement, which is the standard courtesy offered between parties of unequal house standing. Not the abbreviated incline that a sovereign representative might offer a compact official as a diplomatic courtesy in a formal setting. She bowed the way a Velthoran offers formal recognition to someone who has done something that cannot be adequately answered in the available protocol language. A full bow, back parallel to the floor, for a count of 3. In Velthoran protocol, this gesture is reserved for debts that exceed the formal record's capacity to carry them. It is not offered by a sovereign representative to a compact assessor on a border node. It is not offered to anyone of lesser standing. The protocol does not account for this scenario, because the protocol assumes the scenario will not arise. The 6 in gray were very still. When she straightened, her expression had not returned to formal composure. Something underneath it was visible now, the specific expression of a person who has spent 3 days standing at the edge of something they could not stop and has now stepped back from that edge. Not relief exactly, something more structural than relief. The expression of someone for whom a particular kind of weight has been lifted, and who is still adjusting to the absence of it. She said in compact standard, "You are Ren Vaz." "Yes," I said. "You filed the Sovereignty Code Amendment and the Sponsorship Restoration," she said. "Yes." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in a register that was not formal and not composed, and not what a sovereign representative typically offers anyone outside of a private setting, "She told me it was you. She told me you had been there every morning. She told me you found the manifold mismatch, and you knew the environmental criterion, and you filed it in the correct linked form so it would clear on the first pass." Her voice was even, but the evenness had the quality of control, not of calm. "She told me you put a cup of tea at the end of the bench." I looked at Sale. Sale was standing at her mother's side, looking at me with the evaluative attention she brought to the regulation board. After a moment she said, "I told her what you did. I described it accurately." I looked back at her mother. "I have held a border node transit classification for 14 days, she said. "My daughter has sat in this corridor for 11 of them. She read that board every morning because she believed the answer was in it somewhere, and she found it, and she brought it to the right person." She paused. "I did not know the right person was an infrastructure assessor." "The case adjacency was thin," I said. "It held," she said. "The reviewer was reasonable," I said. She looked at me with an expression that meant she had heard what I said and did not intend to allow me to deflect it. "The form was correct," she said. "The documentation was clean. The narrative was precise. My house's legal office reviewed the filing record this morning." She paused. "They said it was one of the better constructed case adjacency arguments they had seen under an assessor's credential." I did not know what to say to that. "I am Rael Voreth Sarath," she said, "sovereign representative of the Second House, Keth Voreth District Registration. I am in the Compact's transit classification, because the border node does not have a designated protocol for a sovereign representative who has been held by a table lag mismatch." She said this precisely, the way Sale said things, as data, provided in the order that made it most useful. "I am telling you this because you helped my daughter without knowing who I was, and I want you to know who I am." I said it was the right form to file. She looked at me steadily. "Yes," she said, "it was." She paused. "The form was right. The timing was right. The documentation was right." Another pause. "You were right to file it without telling her you were going to, so that if it did not clear she would not have to watch it fail." I had not thought of it in exactly those terms. But she was correct. There had been a moment in the filing process, after the amendment form and the case adjacency narrative, while I was attaching the sovereignty table source documentation, when I had considered telling Sale I was filing and had decided against it. The case adjacency argument was defensible but not certain. If it came back rejected, the batch transfer window would be 12 hours shorter, and she would have spent those hours knowing I had tried and failed. The filing was mine to do. The waiting was mine to carry. She had done her part for 11 mornings. "You were right to file it without telling her," Rael Voreth Sarath said again. "It was not a question." "Yes," I said. Sale said from her mother's side, "I knew he was going to file it." Her mother looked down at her. "I knew before I finished telling him about the code mismatch," Sale said. "He pulled up the filing system when I got to the table lag duration. I did not say I knew because it seemed like the right decision not to." She looked at me. "You would have had to explain what you were filing and why, and then if it had not cleared you would have had to explain that too. It was cleaner not to." I looked at her. "It was," I said. She nodded once, satisfied with the confirmation. Her mother watched this exchange with an expression I had no easy category for. It was not surprise. Sale's precision was not new to her. It was something more specific. The look of a person watching a child be exactly who that child is, in a context they have not previously seen, and finding the match precise. She said, "My daughter says you reclassified the manifold repair request under the environmental criterion." "She found the criterion," I said. "I filed the reclassification." She says the repair team came the following morning. The criterion reduced the response window to 48 hours. Rael Voreth Sarath looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I would like to thank you formally on behalf of my house, and I will do so through the appropriate channels, a letter of commendation to the Compact Infrastructure Office, and a formal case notation that will become part of the node's administrative record." She paused. "But I want to say something directly before the formal record." I waited. "In 14 days at a border node," she said, "with a transit classification and a case flag and a window closing, the person who read the situation correctly was an infrastructure assessor who came in early to log a pressure variance and put a cup of tea at the end of a bench. She said this without flourish or performance. It was a plain statement of fact, in the register of someone who deals in facts and knows their weight. My house has legal offices and diplomatic channels and sovereignty protocols. None of them found the table lag mismatch. I said, the regulation board is a good document. She looked at me with the expression of someone who recognized that I was being precise rather than modest, and that she respected the distinction. It is, she said. My daughter read it. Sale said, from 3 paces away. He reads structural documentation the same way I read regulation boards, for what things mean rather than what they appear to say. I looked at her. You said that on the 6th morning, she said. When I asked about the manifold logs, you said infrastructure documentation tells you the truth about a building if you're willing to read the signs it leaves. She paused. I was already reading the regulation board that way. I just did not have the credential. Her mother was watching Sale speak. The composed formal expression was entirely gone. What was there instead was something quieter, the expression of a parent watching a child be exactly who that child is, after 3 days of standing at the edge of losing the chance to watch it again. I looked at Sale. She looked back at me with her evaluative attention, serious and steady. You did the hard part, I said. 11 days on that bench. She considered this. You filed the correct form in 40 hours, she said. That is also the hard part. Both things are true, I said. She nodded, satisfied with this resolution, and looked back at the regulation board. Her mother watched her for a moment. Then she looked at me, and the thing she said next she said quietly, in a register meant for me rather than for the 6 in gray or the empty corridor or the administrative record that would follow. She said you never made her feel like a problem to be solved. I looked at the 2nd cup of tea at the near end of the bench. The corridor's morning light was coming through the west window now, the same angle it came through every morning, and the regulation board's 3rd panel caught it the way it always did, the sovereignty classification section legible from across the room. I said she wasn't. Railvoreth Sereth looked at me for a long moment. Then she did the 2nd thing that surprised the 6 in gray. She reached out and took my hand, briefly, in the Velthoran gesture of personal debt acknowledged. Not a formal grip, but a contact, palm to palm, sustained for exactly 3 seconds. In Second House protocol, this gesture is offered between equals when the debt is of a kind that formal channels cannot fully carry. It is not offered between a sovereign representative and a compact assessor. The protocol does not account for it. One of the 6 said something in Velthoran, quiet and involuntary. Another was very still in a way that suggested effort. Railvoreth Sereth released my hand, stepped back, and returned to the composed formal register in the way that a person trained to wear formality at rest can return to it completely, without residual. The commendation letter will reach the compact infrastructure office within the week, she said. The case notation will be filed this afternoon. Thank you, I said. She inclined her head, the formal Velthoran nod, which from a sovereign representative to a compact assessor on a border node is already more than the protocol requires. Then she and Sale and the 6 walked back through the east entrance, and the corridor was quiet. I sat at the assessor's table for a moment. The 2nd cup of tea was still at the near end of the bench. The regulation board covered the east wall, all 6 panels. The governance structure section caught the morning light on the right side of the 6th panel. The exception chain, the 6 steps, the 5th step available to an assessor with a current credential and a documented case adjacency. I picked up my assessment notes and went back to work on the south wing. The commendation letter arrived 8 days later. It was written in formal compact standard on Second House letterhead, precise, specific, with citations to the exact form numbers and the filing timestamps. The final paragraph, after the formal language of official commendation, contained one sentence that was not in the protocol register. She says to tell you that the level 2 manifold has been quiet every morning since the 5th hour of the 14th. I filed the letter in the node's administrative record, as required. Then I made a note in my assessment log, in the structural documentation section, under environmental observations, where it would be part of the permanent facility record. The pressure variance in the level 2 recirculation manifold had been correctly identified on the 6th morning of the survey rotation by a Velthoran child sitting on a bench in the assessor's waiting corridor. The source of the identification was documented. The classification criterion she had located was cited by number. The note sat between a bearing surface measurement and a load tolerance figure, in the part of the building's record that no one reads unless they are looking for what things mean rather than what they appear to say. Some things correctly documented stay in the record. They do not require anyone to find them. They simply wait, accurate and complete, for the person who comes in early and reads all the way through.